On today's episode of Working with Values, we have William Smith-Stubbs, who is an entrepreneur, non-profit leader, and mental health advocate. He is the co-founder and CEO of Mettlesome, based in Brisbane, Australia, who develop and build products to address social problems. He's a fellow of the Global Good Fund and an Obama leader under the Obama Leadership Foundation. On the show, Will shares his personal experiences of working with values and the values of other organizations. So welcome to the show, Will.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. And as on the Working with Values, we're really keen to know what's your definition of values and what they mean to you.
It is a very good question. And I don't think, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I don't think I would have had a strong definition. Or I think 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have really appreciated that values were that important. But I guess my definition of values, how I explain it to people, especially in a community or an organization or a group sense, is that values are a shorthand way of explaining what is important to us in how we do things. So I can tell you a story, and the best way that I explain that is, my grandfather was in the Air Force, and he was working on an Air Force base in the Pacific Islands. His job was to manage everything day to day. Had no idea what he was doing in his life, had no plan. He was in his early 20s. And he was asked to go pick up a nurse that was flying in one day from a seaplane. And he told me that when he met her, as soon as he met her, he knew he was going to marry her. And he did. A year later, they got married and went on the Air Force base. And the lesson that he took from that life experience was that there's never a good time for anything. But if something does turn up, you should take that opportunity and just figure it out. And he taught my dad that attitude and that belief. And growing up, my dad would say to me, there's never a good time for anything. And that was his shorthand way of explaining this belief to me without having to go through that whole story every single time. And I think really good values do that very well. If they, in a company, a community, a society, whatever it is, even the Australian value of a fair go, it's just a shorthand way of explaining this is what I believe without having to tell you a very long story that takes too long. And it becomes a touchstone for us to go, oh, yeah, that's right. That's how I should behave.
Yeah, well, Mettlesome, your values are very clear: bravery, inspiring, curiosity, tenacity. I think there's another one in be kind.
Kindness.
Kindness. Tell us about that journey and how you came up, because they're very story-based.
Yeah, well, we were a different company for a long time. So we started in 2011 and we were called Sperm for most of that time up until last year. And it got to the stage where we realized who we were when we started and who we were over the past few years. They didn't really exist anymore. We'd become somebody new. So we rebranded, and the name Mettlesome came from the organization we were working with, who I will shout out, DSR Branding, good friends of ours. And we knew that we needed somebody else to look into our hearts to tell us who we were, because doing it yourself is quite difficult. They suggested the name and it just clicked. Mettlesome meaning full of spirit and bravery. That's the work that we like to do. That's what makes us get up every day. And the values process was particularly interesting. We went through a workshop setting of choosing what were the fundamental aspects, attributes that we believed made us who we are. And we landed on those that you've listed. But then to further elaborate them, we then looked for who were inspiring or correlating figures throughout history. So bravery, for instance, is tied to Boudica, the Celtic queen who fought against the Romans. Tenacity is associated with Katherine Johnston, who was one of the actual human computers who calculated NASA trajectories. She was a black woman working in NASA in very much a white male environment, and became famous for the work that she did. Or one of my favorites is Peter Freuchen, who is the value of inspiring. He's a Danish explorer who lived with the Inuit, and he was the last Viking. He did all these amazing things. And for us, there was something really powerful in not only all of the team offering somebody in history that inspired them, that they connected with, but then associating that person with that value so that when you are trying to think day to day, I need to make sure that I am inspiring. If you're lacking that sense that day, if you're not quite sure how to bring some inspiration to your work, you can think of Peter Fruitcombe. What did he do that was so inspiring? Well, he took chances, and he believed wholeheartedly in the work that he was doing. And so that became a really nice way for us to anthropomorphize these values into not just being something on a wall, but they have faces and they have names to them.
It's quite a process, isn't it, to socialize those values, and the tricks that you've used there is tying them into historical figures. But also, I think the point that I'm taking from there is who you were in 2011 and who you are today is different, and things have changed, and that our values are not always stationary, and it does require this process. Tell me more about how you felt that process of reevaluating your values as a group, as a collective, what that did for your culture, what that did for the atmosphere within your organization.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's quite pertinent because the team that we have now is almost entirely new. So a former business partner of mine for 12 years had departed. New people were coming in. And so it was a perfect time to set kind of the new culture and belief system. One other interesting thing that we did with those values were each of them have a poster with the historical figure, the value, a little blurb about that figure. And part of our branding is iconography around a circle with a pen. And the circles that we have in our branding, which are on those posters, those circles are actually team members' handwriting. So we had them draw the circle, we scan that in, and that's now part of our branding. So they actually have their own handwriting as part of those values, which I thought was a really beautiful way to make it more personal. So creating that culture, I think one big thing that is different that we were to who we are now is that when we started, our first campaign that we created as a nonprofit was called Soften the F Up. And it was intentionally quite bold and quite brave and rambunctious. And it was designed to speak to young men that needed to hear the message about vulnerability, but to speak to them in a way that aligned with how they spoke, to just use their language and to twist what they were told about being tough and being hard and not being soft, essentially, and turn it on its head. But where we began were young, like do-gooders that wanted to make change, that were frustrated with the system, were using language that was intentionally a bit inflammatory. And I think if you looked at our values then, bold or brave, definitely, inspiring, probably, kindness, possibly not. And that's not to say that we weren't kind. It's just that we were focused on moving ahead and creating change. And as we've gone through this process, I think one thing that we have adopted is, and it actually came out through some commentary from clients and other partners, that we ooze. There's one person that said, we want a tender. And when we asked them why, they said, you ooze sensitivity. And I loved that because the work that we do is working with different vulnerable groups that are disenfranchised or disempowered through pretty strong systemic structures. And that requires a lot of sensitivity and it requires a lot of kindness. Now, the work that we're doing, the big flagship stuff that we're doing has a lot to do with hate. And our approach to combating hate is you can't solve hate with more hate. You only solve hate with patience, kindness, and understanding. And so it was a bit of a process to imbibe those new values and to set those new values. But the chain, to your question, I can't really articulate it. It's just a different company as a result. We think differently, we act differently. And to be doing the huge projects and dreams that we have, we could only be doing this culture with this set of values. I think before it would seem a little bit too scary, perhaps.
And what I'm hearing from that as in terms of a process of reinvigorating, refreshing your values, one thing is to have conversations within your collective of people that are creating and shaping your future, but also listen to your clients and listen to the words that they're using. And that gives you a sense of who you are to them and who you want to be. Can you tell any more examples of the clients telling you information that has shaped your values?
Yeah, I mean, Dear Silence did a fantastic job of speaking to clients we'd worked with through the studio, funders who'd worked with us through the nonprofit, and mixtures of both partners and research partners and so on. And one really interesting thing that kept coming back was, if you're a client of ours, you'll ask us for one thing, and then through the process, we won't necessarily give you that thing. We'll figure out, actually, what your community or your group needs is actually this. And but this is what you actually need. And we believe that. We're going to tell you that. And funders have found that they'll say, here's grant funding to do this thing through the nonprofit. And we'll say, look, we'll figure it out how to achieve that. And inevitably, the same sort of thing, we come back with the unexpected. And that was pretty consistent, that if you work with us, you have to just trust that we will figure it out, but it probably won't look like what either of us expected to begin with. And I think that is where the tenacity came in of, we don't stop. And I've spoken to, I think this is actually a really good example of the shorthand. I've had team members come to me, and during the midst of the beginning of a project, be really frustrated because I just can't see what the solution is. I can't see where we're going. I can't see how we're going to find the answer to this problem. And I always say to them, yep, that's just part of the process. It's a bit like wandering in the desert. You just have to trust that you're going in the right direction, and you will eventually find it. And they would always come back to me and say, yeah, you were right. It always happens. There is no other way of doing this sort of design work that I'm aware of, other than you have to wander and you have to ask questions, and you get lost and then you figure it out. And that tenacity, I think, is a great shorthand of just stick with the problem. Just keep looking at it, keep asking questions. Don't give up just because it's hard, and eventually you will find the answer to it. Which I can only imagine for Katherine Johnson, calculating how to put people into space must have been very similar experience. So having those values, I think on really good days, it just reduces the number of times that we each have to worry. And instead we have those values to say, oh yeah, that's why we have that value, because this stuff is hard.
And what I'm taking from that process is that you've gone through that process of saying tenacity, etc., but it's the working with the values and talking about them as you go along that you develop a shared understanding of what that value means to you through trial and error, through experience, through trial and tribulation, through dilemmas. That's when you really are. That's what tenacity means to us. We'd love to know more about other organizations that you've worked with where you've taken them through on that values journey itself to help them understand their own values.
Yeah, I mean, it's why I say, I think 5 years ago, if you'd asked me about the importance of values, I probably wouldn't have a very high opinion. And it was only over time, both personal experiences of myself going through programs like the Obama Foundation's leadership program, that I understood my own values, but then also working with clients. And there was one, kind of two, that we were working with one here in Australia. They're a professional services firm, and we were designing a national wellbeing strategy for them. And we were halfway through, and they, typical for somebody who works with us, realized how much they loved us after they started working with us. And they came and said, hey, we're trying to redesign our company values. And they had a federation of businesses working as one. And they wanted to align essentially 7 different company value sets into one set. And so we came in halfway through that process and had to kind of figure out how to find the horizon for them in that. And we ended up with 5 simple worded values that were completely different to what they had before, but it took elements from each of those 7 federation offices and wove them together. And the number one lesson I took from that is the difficulty with words and values is I can say to you a word like bold or brave, and you can interpret that entirely differently based upon your history. And I think you're exactly right, Stephen, that it's one thing to set values. That's really just the beginning. Once you rolled it out, the second stage is actually getting a consistent history behind those values so that when we came back 2 years later, those 5 values, everybody knew them. They were on the walls, yes, but people were using them day to day and they were saying these words and they created new life for these values that I would never have anticipated. And that was a really rewarding process. And they actually said to me once, post-COVID, we did that for them just before COVID, in about 2021, mid-2021. They said to me, people in culture said to me, the values got us through the pandemic. When they all had to go home, there were conversations. One of the values was heart. And there was conversations with the partners about what do we do? We've got clients that are freaking out. We've got staff that are freaking out. And they said heart. That's all we're going to remember, just have heart. And they just said to the staff, go home. So we're going to do, go home right now. Be with your families. That's what's important. So that was wonderful. That led us to doing our second values project, which is entirely different. It was with their New Zealand counterpart who had 15 different offices in tiny towns like Brisbane or Taranaki, all the way up to Auckland, Wellington, very different cultures, very different environments. And they wanted to bring values together. And we said, this time, we need to do it from the very, very beginning. So not coming in halfway. And we want to talk to all of your staff. So there was about 800 people. So we ran countless interviews and workshops so that every single person had a chance to have an input into the values process. And what we found was that even though you had different towns and cities that had varying levels of culture variation, one consistent thing for each of them was that where they lived, it was the natural environment that meant something to them and that defined what that city was like. So we started looking at the natural environment as being a core way to theme the values, which naturally New Zealand, that should, we felt, be informed by Maori culture. So then we worked with the Maori business group that was part of that company, so Maori employees, and we then settled upon, based on their insight, the pepia, which is a traditional way of introducing yourself in Maori culture, which is based on your mountain, your river, your people, your canoe, and your marae, your meeting place. So that became the way that every office could have the same values, their mountain, their river, their people, their marae, which would each represent something. So mountain would represent being strong and seeing the future and taking strong steps, but you could adjust it for which mountain you were closest to in New Zealand. And it was a really, really wonderful process to go through. We then worked with the Maori Taireo Language Institute to verify that this was a correct way of doing it. It was informed by over 800 staff, everybody getting to see it, getting to approve it, getting to put their information into it. And that was, I think, of all the projects that we've done, the most rewarding to see that this is truly a democratic thing, that the staff of this company chose these values. It was their decision. It wasn't just handed down to them by a board somewhere.
Again, and two things in terms of that process, as you've said, is involving people in the identification of the values. And I'm sure that there would have been lots of information you would have fed back to the organization, not just about the values, about what you were sensing and what you were noticing around the culture. So in terms of that process, I'm curious to know more about that, because 800 people, it's not that you just come up with a set of values, you would have come up with other insights. What were some of the other insights that you were able to communicate to them that they were able to use that in terms of the whole socialization of the values?
Yeah, that's a really, it's a good reminder. There were instances where when we realized that the natural environment was a common denominator. So if you were an Aucklandite, you could relate to hiking the mountain nearby as much as somebody who was in Taranaki. That said, when we looked at the natural environment and natural resources and attributes like mountains and rivers, and I think through a very Western view, you would associate certain elements with certain behaviors or values. And then when we sat and we talked with Maori staff and the Maori business group, they corrected us to say, well, maybe that's how you view it. But in New Zealand, in traditional Maori view, this is what these elements represent. And so it was a learning process for us to understand the context in which this has to exist. There's no point bringing in the wrong view of what these elements are. I think there was some trepidation. I think that the biggest challenge was, and it is, I think it's a pretty consistent thing with values as the group that's using the values gets bigger and bigger. How do you ensure that they are representative of variance while still being cohesive? Because I can roll out values to these 15 different offices, but if they feel like, well, this was something that was designed for Wellington, not for me, like I'm different. That's probably one of the hardest things I think of designing values. What we found was the loophole, or I guess the short circuit, was creating almost two sets of values. You have the theme of values, your mountain, river, canoe, people in the Monet, but you can then tailor that based upon what your mountain is, what your river is. And that gave them that sense of uniqueness while also being part of the whole. So a flotilla of ships rather than just having the same ship that looks exactly the same. I think it was also surprising, not just for us, but probably for the client, in how many people wanted to be involved. We had capped our sessions at 25 people, and we had some sessions that had 70. And you just couldn't keep them away. They wanted to be part of it. I wondered, I'm not sure if you've seen this in your work, but I think values still gets this rap as being, it's a cutesy thing that was really popular in the 90s and it sits on like plaques on the wall, but it means nothing. People don't care about it. Whereas I'm finding, and maybe especially lately, staff are hungry for it because they want, it's a human nature to want to have clarity, and values gives you clarity, gives you the clarity as to what group am I a part of and what do we believe in. And if you don't have those clearly defined, they will emerge regardless, and often probably not the ones you'd like there to be. And so I think anybody that's in the area of thinking about, does my company need values? If you're asking that question, it probably already does have them. It's just a question of whether you want those ones or not, and have they been defined.
Yes. And as you say, if you don't have a conversation about them, there will be values working behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And the things that what I take from your case study there is around the importance of understanding the complete context, as you said, of understanding how the Maori interpretation of those words and what you saw them as, but also that critical piece, as you said, the personalization, so that you had your anchor values for the entire organization, but then each site could personalize them according to their region. And that's something really unique in terms of values. And what does it mean to us here? What are our interpretation of that? Yeah. So how has that influenced your own organization and other organizations, so that they sound like a very rich experience with respect to values? How's that influenced your work after that date as a result of being involved in those projects?
I think if I can, so I think the work has been influenced by it. And I think our culture here, in terms of how we approach each other and we approach work, is a lot more focused on our values, and they as a shorthand for a principle or a belief. I think even like myself, I am drastically more aware of my own values, and I wish I'd known what they were much sooner in life. And my values have been influenced by where I've worked and mentors that I've had and companies that I've worked for before starting my own. And about to be a dad, I think it's going to come pretty handy as well. And those values, there was a process I went through in a leadership development program of selecting your values. And this was back in 2019. And you had to drill down from a list of like 100 values and keep eliminating them until you got to the values that you couldn't live without. And I had health, service, bravery, authenticity, and kindness. And then that was 2019. And just this, it was 2024 now. So just last year, I was in another program in the States, and there was a fellowship I was going through. And one of the activities we did was to do that same process. And I was really curious to see how my values had changed in the past few years. And interestingly, authenticity I've replaced with bravery. And I wonder if that was because I'm much more comfortable being who I am, but now I need to take even bigger risks and bigger steps. Service had changed to support, I think it was, and health was still there, but kindness consistently was my number one. And I've become very aware of this, that when there are some values that you have, that you believe in, that you have internalized, if you see other people not living up to those and not exhibiting those, you can respond in different ways. And of all of my values, if I see somebody who is not expressing health and looking after themselves, I feel bad. And I wish that they did. Or if I see somebody who is not taking brave steps, I'm understanding. But interestingly, kindness, if I see somebody who is not being kind, it actually makes me bad. And that's been something that I've struggled with to understand about myself. And I'm curious about how that actually, for us as a company, one of our values is kindness, and we work with somebody who is not kind. And I've seen this actually in the past, say 6 months. We had a partnership opportunity. In our beginnings of that partnership, we found a big values misalignment where their sense of kindness just wasn't really there for us. And that's fine. Maybe that's just not part of their value set. But it became very difficult for us, not just emotionally to work together. I think to create really good work, it was very difficult. And so it became a very strong decision about, do we invest in this partnership or not? And I think prior to having this list of values, not just for myself, but for the company, I would have really struggled. Whereas, and maybe I'm sounding like a broken record to say shorthand, but I think values are just such a great way to shorten the time that you need to explain a belief, all the time you need to make a decision. Because you just say, well, it doesn't align with my values, it's not the right decision to make. I think that's probably been one of the most valuable thing about values to me in the past couple of years, is just clarity.
What I'm hearing from that is that alignment between understanding personal values and working with organizational values. And particularly when you're a founder and it's your own business. And that process of understanding your personal values is an important process for working with organizational values. And how has that helped team members who may not have thought about their values before that you've worked with?
We actually did do a personal value session as well as part of our last retreat. And I don't think many of them have done personal values process. And I think they found it quite rewarding. And I'm very invested in that for our team. So I think it's not my job to help them figure out who they are. That's everybody's own journey. But if there are things that I can help through the work that we're doing for you to figure out, oh, this is what I believe in, this is what I love doing, this is the things that make my heart expand. That's very valuable for them. It's also very valuable for us as a team to have a better understanding. Stephen's number one value is authenticity. So if I'm coming to him with a problem, I need to be super transparent and super clear, because I know if I'm making a huge assumption here, Stephen, using you as an example, but if you picked up that I was not being completely authentic, probably not going to listen to what I'm saying. And I think just having an understanding about each other is really useful. But that said, the knowledge that will change and grow, and your values probably will shift over time. And so constantly being aware of that and refreshing it, I think, is also really important. I am curious, if we were to do our values again in 5 years, would the set that we have still be there or not? And this stage, I actually think they would be. But I guess time will tell.
I think it's a crucial step for organizations. Often focus entirely on the organizational values process and not allowing time for conversations about each other's values, because the organizational values don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the context of personal values, societal values. There's a whole heap of things that are going on that are shifting and shaping that process. And what I'm hearing from you is the importance of allowing time for conversations around not only the organizational values, but the personal values. It's not your job to help them work out who they are, but to help them understand what's really important to them is an important part of your organizational effectiveness and efficiency.
Yeah, and I think you just touched on something that I've seen is pretty common, is a fear in some values processes when creating them for clients that, let's say you're a team member of ours who looks at bravery, tenacity, inspiration, kindness, and thinks, well, those aren't my values. And well, that's okay. You can have your own set of values that don't include any of those. But when you're here, that's what we believe in. And that's what our culture is. And I suspect somebody who did not have those values probably wouldn't last here very long. But it's also, and I've said this a few times, that so I'm married into a different culture. My wife's family moved to Australia from China in the 70s. And the first time I met them was quite a culture shock. And their set of family values were quite different to my family's values. Very much collective, very much ways of expressing love or doing things together that I struggled to understand to begin with. But over time, one, I accepted that when I'm visiting or I'm part of that family or I'm an active member with that side of my family, that's how I should behave in that context, because that's the environment I'm coming into. That's the community that I'm joining. It doesn't mean that the rest of my life I have to adjust myself and to, when I'm not around them, it's that way. And certainly going to my family, my wife had the same experience. We're all a bit weird. That said, I've realized over time and I've noticed that there are a couple of behaviors or values that I have taken from them and I have taken on board and that I do now exhibit even when I'm not around them. And I think that is very similar to a company. You can join it and at first be very weirded out by it, but there has to be something that you're willing to internalize, although you're just not going to last in that environment. And I think that's the same for a company, a family, a sports team, whatever it might be. If it's not right for you, it's not right for you, but maybe it will be. You just have to give it a go.
Yep, great. And the other point that I sort of wanted to come back to was that point that you made around how values helped you make a decision around a particular partner or a potential partner or a client, or that those values, because you'd had that conversation and they were clear and present in front of you, and you, as you said, you had clarity around what your tolerance levels would be, that helped you make a decision of whether to stay with that client or not. Can you give what other examples do you have around how your values have helped you in the work that you do or the decisions that you make about where to focus your areas?
Yeah, I mean, look, in business, there are times when people will rub you the wrong way, or you come across people that you can clash with or have conflict with. And I think The biggest growth that I've had in the past couple of years is really understanding that if kindness is my value, my number one value personally, and one of our main company values, that it's often best to just react with kindness, even when you don't think the other person deserves the kindness, and not being drawn into unnecessary behaviors that you might be angry or you might be incensed by, but remaining true to your values. And that's really hard to do, to not jump into a fight when you feel like it's deserved. But if kindness, for instance, is one of your values, it actually just makes it a lot easier, because you can say, well, no, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be kind to this person. There was actually a team member of mine who said to me something the other day, a few months ago. And for instance, I'm very much of the belief that competition between companies, I'm not really about it. I don't really believe in the work that we do that we need to be secretive or highly competitive. We believe in the work that we're doing. We believe we do it well, and we're focused on what we do. We're not here to keep tabs on others or try and compete. And if I've had people reach out who are building similar things and want advice or input, and I'm more than happy to do it. And this team member said to me that she observed through that the long-term value of human kindness. And I think that has been something, I think it's perfectly put in how I think about that. That's, and I've learned over the past couple of years, just be kind. It's different to being nice. Just be kind. And long-term, things will work out way better than needing to be a shark and try and win at everything. I think that having that as a value makes that decision in those moments just so much easier, and such a shorter, again, a shorter time span from what should I do through to, oh, this is how I should respond.
So we're just coming up towards the end. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And that's the idea behind these working with values, is to really draw on people that are working with values and experimenting with values on a day-to-day level so that people can learn from their experiences. So, Will, what we'd love to know, what advice would you give if you've got a leader who is wanting to develop their capabilities around working with values? What would be your top 3 tips for them to focus on and to help them work with values?
Great question. I think one, it is very important for a leader to have values and to be very clear about their values. People follow people who have values for a number of reasons, which I want to get into, but that's just a fundamental. If you're a leader who has values, you can make a lot of stuff happen. It's very difficult to lead without values, because people can sense that. They can sense that you don't have the clarity around who you are. So I'd say it is, first of all, it's very important. And second of all, I think as a leader, if you're at the point where you're thinking, how do I start to utilize values or understand values? The first thing is, I think, understand what your values are, regardless of what the company's values are, but what are your values as a leader? With somebody is reporting to you or working for you, they need to know what they're going to get from you. I had one of my best managers when I was in a sales role years ago. I knew with him, Paul, that he would just tell me the truth. He would just tell me exactly as it was, and I could trust him to that. So I felt like truth was one of his core values. And I was in my early 20s. I was quite confident, and he came to me and he sat down and he said, look, the executives have told me to tell you to be less confident, and I've been instructed to somehow reduce your confidence. I don't know why I should do that. That seems like a bad idea. So I'm just going to tell you that I did that, and we'll just work from there. I said, that sounds great. And from there, I knew that if I ever needed anything, I could trust him. And to this day, I still think so fondly of him, because he trusted me with information and I trusted him. And I think I haven't seen him in, 15 years or something. And if he needed something and he called, I would do it straight away. And I think that is the power of values and leadership, is it builds a following. It makes people want to help you. So start with what your values are. And even if that's a process of just sitting down and drilling down value descriptors until you get to 5 that you can't live without, it's a great place to start.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yep. So be really clear about your own values, because people want to follow people who have a values. It is a process, as you said, that when you sat down at 2019 and then you sat down again last year, there'd been some shift. And so that's the other piece that I received from you, is that it is a process.
Definitely.
It's not one and done. Great, Will. It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show, to hear your stories, your lived experience of working with values and your passion for it. Thank you for that, and all of the best with the work that you and your team are doing at Mettlesome.
Thank you so much for having me.